Hi, welcome to the world today. We're going to look at the Korean Peninsula, where over the last few months there have been increasing tensions between the United States and the Democratic Republic of Korea, to give North Korea its official name. The cause for the tension was the sudden announcement by the North Koreans that they were going to test a nuclear missile. This created panic, not so much in Seoul, the capital of South Korea, where they're used to these things and take them more calmly, but in Washington, D.C., in the White House, where it was blown up into a major crisis with President Trump threatening to retaliate in kind if these missiles were ever used, which there was no intention of ever doing, or at least not as far as we know. Now, the situation is quite strange in the sense that two total narcissists, Trump and Kim Jong-un, confronting each other naturally makes people slightly nervous. But in reality, this is a long history of relations between North Korea and the United States, a very tormented history, between both the Koreas, especially the North, and the Japanese Empire. And it's time, I think, to discuss various other questions related, because the Korean Peninsula is discussed a great deal, especially North Korea and its more zany aspects, but very few people are aware of the history. I am really pleased to have with us today Adam Cathcart, who is the author of Change and Continuity in North Korean Politics and lectures in Chinese history at the University of Leeds. Adam, welcome.
Thank you.
Change and continuity in North Korean politics. Now, continuity we all accept. Explain to me what the change is.
Well, there have been many cosmetic changes, certainly since 2011, when Kim Jong-il died in December, and after his very dramatic funeral of that year in the winter. There's been a lot of speculation, of course, on the outside, and desire and hope, not just in Washington, but also in Beijing, that changes would come with the new leadership, that North Korea would open up to more market forces, be more friendly towards certainly China, and possibly have a rapprochement with the United States and not threaten South Korea, and that the South Koreans would in turn then lessen the pressure on the North. Those desires then feed into any scrap of information that we receive about changing policies in North Korea. But largely what we've seen has been kind of a changing face, and that is, of course, Kim Jong-un, who you mentioned. He was married at a relatively young age. His wife was sort of
a rock star.
Yes, exactly. There was sort of rock pop music. There's one band which has now been reduced to performing more or less every time a missile is launched or a major nuclear test is done. And they come out and sort of give signals. And in fact, the whole history of the North Korean missile program, which you just talked about, the people who are arms control experts are forced to use the main data that they're using are photographs given by the North Koreans to the rest of the world about the new fruition of the nuclear program, missile program, as kind of separate entities, but of course combining for the same purpose of deterrence against the United States. They are reduced to using those images from the rock band's performances. That is where the key histories are shown visually of the North Korean missile program. And they are frantically screen grabbing all this stuff and putting it together and saying, now look at this O-ring and this, whatever their vocabulary is. So change in the sense of expanding capabilities, but people are looking for change in the economy. Is the state going to continue to try to lead and try to get a little more hands-off in certain ways? But I think at the end of the day, continuity rules the roost.
Also change, I suppose, to a certain degree, on the way people are dressed compared to 30 years ago, that they get more to eat compared to the worst years of the famine under Kim Jong-un's father. And generally visitors to North Korea have come back saying that while the regime is the same, there is less violence against their own people. Is this true?
Well, I think there are signals, certainly, that there's an attempt certainly being made among the populace to, on the one hand, keep this stringent kind of anti-US, not just the rhetoric, but kind of the lifestyle, the training, militia training among the public and things like that. But at the same time, there has been a desire to say, relax a little bit, right? We're not going to tighten our belts any longer. That's a phrase that's used often. But to see that as absolute change, I mean, one of the things to do in this book is to try to run an experiment to say how much has it changed. And there's new terms like Pyongyang, which they call parallelism, which means we're going to have self-defense or nuclear deterrent as well as developing the economy in spite of sanctions. And you say, wow, that's different, that's new. He's emphasizing living standards. But if you go back to traditional socialist principles and the expressions of the Korean Workers' Party in the 40s and 50s and 60s, exactly, it's core, it's all there. And the role of even of the mass organizations hasn't adapted very much. They're still used for labor purposes, mobilization, education. And this whole Pyongyang line, or the parallelism, can be traced to a speech that Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean state, gave in the early 60s. So you can work through the data and wash through it, but ultimately continuity does ultimately come through.
But what impact have developments in China, social economic developments in China, it's spurred to virtually the top of the ladder in terms of industrial production, etc., had on North Korea? Because despite all the stuff they talked about, Juche and self-reliance, they were heavily dependent on the Soviet Union and China for most of their existence. With China being what it is today, a real economic powerhouse, has that had an impact, at least on the border areas with China? I'm told a lot of Chinese television, Chinese serials can be seen on North Korean television sets close to the border. But also on a more fundamental level, has there been some real discussion inside the Korean Workers' Party on the Chinese road?
Oh, that's a really important question, I think. To take the part of it that deals with the border first, I think there has been there's daily contact, of course, along the border. There's a lot of trade. Minerals has been a big piece of that, and Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, pointed that out. Not very original, because his predecessor had as well, to say this is a major point of leverage that the Chinese have, because the North Koreans have become dependent on the money they receive from importing, or exporting rather, minerals into China. So structurally, the trade in raw materials is still quite important. That's the big one. But on a people-to-people basis, we do see quite a lot more than we had. And that's not just Kim Jong-un. This started under kind of the late Kim Jong-il period. So Kim Jong-il became quite friendly to China in about 2008, 2009, when he became quite feeble because he had I think a heart attack, something like that, or a stroke. And he, more or less, then we began to recognize the succession was coming. No one knew who Kim Jong-un was. There were rumors for almost 2 years. But Kim Jong-il began a series of trips to China. And what that resulted in was commitment from the Chinese, a lot more money coming in, a few big Chinese companies coming in to actually set up mineral extraction plants in North Korea to increase their capacity there. But you had a large number, and this has come to kind of fruition now, of North Koreans working in China legally, right? So about 50,000
like
North Koreans.
Migrant workers.
Yes, precisely, yeah. And they're there under North Korean control for sort of 2 or 3 year terms. So those are interesting people. And of course, the Americans are now telling the Chinese, you should really turn the screws and get rid of all those people because they're slaves. We don't want North Koreans outside of North Korea, apparently, because what the things they might see and learn from the North Korean perspective is, they want them under control. The Americans just want them back in North Korea because of the money they're taking in. But on the theoretical level, as you mentioned earlier, about kind of the Chinese model, right? The North Koreans, if you read The Atlantic, these kind of mainstream neoliberal outlets, when is the next Deng Xiaoping going to come into North Korea, or when are the North Koreans going to open up special economic zones? Now, they did have a man inside the Politburo, Jang Song-taek, the uncle of Kim Jong-un, who had been supposedly an advocate for that, and there was an opening up of this.
Is he the one who was executed?
Precisely, yeah, in December 2013. So precisely just under 2 years after Kim Jong-il's death, and so this was quite a shocking event in North Korea. But what that forced then is kind of a restructuring of some of the North Korean-Chinese trade relationships. And the Chinese, after his death, sort of started to say, this was the guy, he was our big contact, he was sort of our hope, sort of a regent figure.
So it wasn't just a random killing. Basically, Kim Jong-un targeted the person he saw, I mean, regrettable though it is, who he thought was, represented the Chinese interests in the Korean Politburo.
And that trend then continued even this past February when Kim Jong-un's older brother was killed in the Kuala Lumpur airport, yes, because he was living under Chinese protection in Macau. You read Chinese Foreign Ministry and Chinese Foreign Affairs periodicals, and you'll see the Chinese tried to keep a lid on it. They didn't want this to become a big propaganda problem, to kind of say, North Korea, the North Korean leadership has really insulted us. But I think if you talk to Chinese academics and others, yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, the reality is, Adam, that only the Chinese could effectively prevent the United States from doing what it might wish to do. I'm not saying it does, what it might wish to do, which is either to cross over or bomb or whatever. I think that's completely unlikely as long as the Chinese are saying don't do it. But were China to withdraw its behind-the-scenes protection of this state, it wouldn't be long.
Well, I think there's a debate inside the Communist Party now in China about there's a mutual alliance of friendship and security between North Korea and China, which was signed in the 60s. Back in better days, it wasn't the honeymoon by any means, but the Chinese troops had left the Korean Peninsula in 1958. They had remained after the Korean War. So from 50 to 53, you have the Korean War, another 5 years of Chinese occupation where they're helping with some very explicit things. Kim Il-sung, rather, well before Kim Jong-un was born, sort of wanted the Chinese to leave. There was a bit of factional infighting. The Chinese have been careful ever since then, and Mao had really set this up, and they're still very much in this line of thinking towards North Korea is don't play games with North Korean internal politics.
So that was his line.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't want you to feel as if we are that we are trying to manipulate various factions within North Korea or take a certain stance. So even when they were aligned with Kim Jong-un's uncle, for example, in 2013, that was not particularly explicit. The protection of the brother up until 2017, it was not done with kind of a program to say, we have a Korean government in exile here, a North Korean government in exile that we're ready to put in. So they've been hands-off in that regard. And that goes along with Zhou Enlai's principles that they put forward in the 1950s of a peaceful coexistence, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. And you could argue that the Chinese have really held to that since then. So I think that's the difficulty with kind of looking at the Chinese attitude toward North Korea now. But you're absolutely right that the Americans, when they see North Korea, yes, they see a missile program and there's a lot of excitement. And they see nuclear tests, and this gets people quite in a furor. But behind them is a much bigger, more powerful country. And the Chinese, I think, are having the debate inside the party about if we are explicit and take away this treaty of alliance to punish North Korea, is that just going to embolden the Americans? So I think as long as these Cold War alignments remain and the U.S.-North Korean relationship remains highly antagonistic, with, of course, the South Koreans, even a left-wing government in Seoul needs to sort of be tough against North Korea, and the new government in Seoul has been, I would argue, pretty robust in its desire to deter North Korea in their language. So I think the Chinese-U.S. polarity is going to remain fairly fraught.
But turning to South Korea for a minute, I mean, the birth of this regime is really the direct result of U.S. intervention. The personnel who made up this regime were, for a large part, those who had collaborated with the Japanese in occupying the Korean Peninsula. They're pretty discredited people. And it wasn't really till the 80s, I would say, mid-80s, that South Korea came into its own. Before that, it was either corrupt politicians tainted by links with the Japanese or military dictators of one sort or the other. So it's not the case that we had this, awful communist dictatorship in the north and something pristine pure in the south. Both were, for differing reasons, quite tarnished regimes. And that is why I think the South Korean example never had as big an effect on North Korea as, for instance, West Germany did on East Germany. Very different, these two separations. And the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, which has been on the agenda in different ways of both sides and the United States, and which began to move forward during the Clinton-Albright administration. There was some talk of it, a discussion was begun. The question was, how much money would it need? How many billions would we have to pay the North Koreans to achieve a peaceful reunification? And then Madeleine Albright visited Pyongyang. Then came the Bush administration, and all that was stopped. And I once asked an advisor to the Bush administration, why is this stopped? And she explained, she was an advisor to Rumsfeld, she said, the central question for us really is not just Korea, but the region. And she said to me, informally, she said, you've not seen the gleam in the eyes of the South Korean generals when we speak to them and mention reunification, because integrating that will have problems, but they don't look at it like that. They see that the unified Korea will be a nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Thanks to the fact that the North is, this will come under the joint Korean army. And she said to me, if the Korean Peninsula becomes a nuclear power, it becomes impossible for us to prevent the Japanese from acquiring nuclear weapons. Mm. If you have Korea, Japan, and China, all three nuclear powers in this region, the relationship of forces shifts away from us. It was actually the most cogent explanations I'd heard. But so what I want to ask you, Adam, is all talk of unification now off the agenda?
Well, both the Americans and the South Koreans have told the North Koreans in statements, not in face-to-face meetings, of course, that accelerated movements towards reunification are off the agenda. They want to dial back, they haven't gone so far as to say we're going to dial back what the North Koreans see as subversion, whether that's a broadcast, USBs going in over the border, balloons and things like that, dropping propaganda on them. But they have tried to assure the North Koreans that they don't need to worry. There's a certain amount of stability here. We are not going to engage in a decapitation strike, or use the kill chain. There's all these sort of military terms that are brought in to just normal everyday discussion about North Korea. And the Americans are not going to have a preemptive strike. But then, of course, that goes up against the rhetoric from Donald Trump, which kind of veers from here to there, and the people he's speaking with. And if the Secretary of State is gone a year from now or 6 months from now, do any of these promises matter? The North Koreans generally don't take those promises for worth very much because they're assuming the worst case scenario. And part of that goes back to the earlier part of your question about the roots of their strategy and looking at South Korea as a very serious threat. This was not a benign, defenseless democracy, although they were invaded quite quickly by the North Koreans in June of 1950. They were rolled back quite quickly. But Syngman Rhee, who was the American hand-picked, sort of the expatriate leader of South Korea until 1960, was very, very vocal about the desire to reunify the peninsula. And the legacies from that period are still somewhat there in South Korea today, even though you've now gone through developmental dictatorship in South Korea in the 60s and 70s, through a kind of a democracy that's now more or less consolidating with an American presence inside the country, about 30,000 troops. In the meantime, so they're working out the security arrangements always, and with the American big picture in mind, with the South Koreans perhaps having their own plans. But those roots of the policies are the national security laws, which more or less forbid any North Korean propaganda, any pro-North Korean activity inside the country, a very strong police presence, which has been dialed back, but the national security law is still around. It's very easy to get in trouble as a pro-communist figure or a perceived pro-communist figure in South Korea. And then, of course, although the South Korean president and the foreign ministry and the Ministry of Unification are saying to the North Koreans, we want to build trust with you. They don't believe it. The previous administration of South Korea said the same thing. They called it trust politic. It went absolutely nowhere. And the South Koreans still have governors for all of what they called 5 North Korean provinces. The North Koreans have multiplied their provinces and changed the boundaries, but the South Koreans have governors ready to go. There's a government in a box, which is why you never hear about a North Korean government in exile being sponsored in the United States or elsewhere. So I think that there are concerns, I think, about kind of the South Korean behavior towards North Korea. Now, the concerns are different than they used to be, right? We used to, in the 50s, if you read Foreign Office papers or American diplomatic archives, they were worried about killings. I mean, anti-communist killing squads going into North Korea, absolute looting of the North Korean banks or whatever it was, minerals. But today, it would be a different kind of occupation, right? Assuming that the Chinese let it happen.
It would be an economic occupation, really, primarily. And then also a sort of a political integration on some level, one assumes, and then finally the military side of it, because the North Korean army is pretty huge. I think it's the 5th or 6th largest.
Yes, and I wonder to what extent our experience with looking at German integration or this kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, how do you deal with the past, how do you overcome the past?
Yeah, no, the German one was a disaster on that front,
yeah.
Now that we've had time to study it, I mean, large numbers of very decent people actually were chucked out of work because they would simply worked in East Germany. So many were dissidents, hostile to the regime, not employed again, large-scale economic destruction of East German industry, etc., etc. And of course, East Germans said that they were treated as second-class citizens, and many say it to this day, that we were just seen by the Westies, that the Easties are not quite German, they've been tainted. So it's a cheek that, given that a large number of Nazi collaborators were kept in NATO, including Rommel, second in command, became head of the NATO forces. So it's a bit of a joke, all this, but nonetheless, it happened, and it happened quite quickly. And they were very symbolic, those scenes, which sort of formally ended the Cold War, but in reality proclaimed US hegemony and the triumph of capitalism. That is what I'm saying doesn't look likely like happening, that you will see, let's say, 500,000 North Koreans rushing to Panmunjom to cross the demilitarized zone and enter South Korea.
I think the North Korean response to all of these things that we've been talking about is heresy, right? We would never discuss this in Pyongyang,
no.
And that is because the nuclear deterrent, in their view and in the official kind of rhetoric of the state, is that this more or less is our trump card. We can prevent
anything.
Yes, and if you talk to people like Jonathan Pollock, these kind of nuclear experts with a very firm grounding in history and political science, not just a technician, they will tell you that they believe that the North Korean goal with their nuclear deterrent is not to nuke the United States or to lob a missile which would guarantee their destruction at Seattle or Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, wherever. It's to use the nuclear bombs on the ground to stop a land invasion from the south or from China in the event of internal instability inside of North Korea. So I think that the means by which, the process by which a quick reunification would happen, these are things that people in the Pentagon and in the Ministry of Defense, I think, in Whitehall are kind of, they're paid to think about often. But I think what's lacking in a lot of these discussions is a discussion about North Korean people that goes beyond what do we do with the worst criminals who were in charge of the camps.
No, this is true. Adam, let's discuss one other aspect, which is pretty unique in the modern world. I mean, we know what the South Koreans did, how they ruled, etc., etc. The form taken by the Workers' Party in North Korea is unlike that of any other state which came from those origins, socialism, communism, whatever. Effectively the rule of a single family over a state. And it's not easy to find a rational answer here. I mean, one could say, and it would be a fact, that all the Korean communists who were in the leadership of the Korean revolutionary struggle against the Japanese, or who fought in China with the Chinese communists, or whatever, that many of them were on a much higher level politically, intellectually than Kim Il-sung, who was not regarded as a major figure, but was transformed by the Japanese into one, largely through their propaganda, because he did wipe out a Japanese platoon during the guerrilla struggle against the Japanese occupation. But leaving all that aside, Kim did, and he's not the only one who did this. I mean, Stalin did it as well in a different way, but he did it, is wipe out all alternatives. But that they did. They killed their own comrades, their own people. But was it necessary to impose family rule? Surely there were other people in the party, in the army, who could have succeeded Kim Il-sung. And this is a slight mystery to me, because it seems totally irrational.
Well, first I would agree with your assessment of one of the major differences, the points of differentiation or uniqueness of the North Korean Revolution and the North Korean Workers' Party to other socialist parties around the world, or Leninist party states, and as deriving from Kim Il-sung's grasp of Marxism and Leninism and even Stalinism as being rather slippery, right? He was not anywhere close to the level as a theorist as others involved in the struggle. People who had studied in Germany, translated Marx from German into Korean. Yes, yeah. And others who had spent time with the Chinese Communist Party in Yan'an. There was a provincial government in Shanghai. There were people sort of with leftist leanings floating through the United States, working with the Japanese Communist Party in places like Seattle. I mean, there's a global reach to this Korean Revolution that somehow gets boiled down to this Manchurian guerrilla faction taking all power in a process that lasts gradually through 1945, through the Korean War. It's a gradual narrowing through to 1956 when, and I think there are a couple of turning points after the Korean War. One is 1956 when the Chinese faction, the so-called Yan'an faction, is more or less forced out. Some of them flee to China. And then in the late 60s, when Kim Jong-il is kind of coming into his own as a man in his, I suppose, in his early 30s, around the same age as Kim Jong-un is today, when he begins to grip the reins, much like Jiang Qing did in China, of the propaganda bureau and of the arts and of things like this. And then they began to winnow out even the history of alternatives. So what we've seen now is a continual sort of purification, a sort of a burning out, if you will, in the sense of a chemistry experiment, you know, of all the impurities that are not Kim Il-sung centered. So we're now 40, 50 years into that process, which has basically wiped the history of the Korean Workers' Party within North Korea in its own materials and brought it down to it's all about this family, and it's been about this family since the 1920s, when Kim Il-sung was how old? You know, in his late teens somehow. He's become this messianic figure. And that's understandable to kind of go back to the anti-Japanese struggle. The Chinese do and others do it. Obviously. But this family-centered aspect, I think, is one that is quite interesting.
How long can it last? I mean, sooner or later, I mean, like it happens to monarchies, they collapse. I mean, the English one is exceptional in that regard. But, you know, or they become bicycling monarchs like in Sweden and Scandinavia. But by and large, this form of rule evaporates. And surely there are enough people inside the North Korean DPRK army and the party to set up a provisional government, to find some other way of making the transition from one leader to the other, which would certainly make the Chinese very happy.
Exactly, about China, I think that's more or less what I think they are looking for, is kind of maintain the sovereignty of the DPRK, just phase out the Kim family somehow, although they don't talk about that very often and very openly. But the idea being that this is not simply going to be blended in with the Republic of Korea. There may be a long transition process, I think, that goes through with that.
Adam, we've come to the end of our time. We await that transition.
Thank you.
Good to have you.